Hello, greetings! So for this lesson, we shall study the concept of plate tectonics. Now, the story of plate tectonics begins with Alfred Wegener or Alfred Wegener. He is a German meteorologist and geophysicist who noticed something when he looked at a map of the world. Now, Wegener came up with a theory or a proposal called the continental drift hypothesis or the continental drift theory. Now, according to the continental drift hypothesis or theory, Wegener stated that the continents had once been joined together to form a single supercontinent. Wegener proposed that the supercontinent, which he called Pangaea, began to break apart about 200 million years ago and form the present land masses. So that was his proposal of the supercontinent called Pangaea. That's about 200 million years ago. Pangaea started breaking up. So that formed the present continents. Now, Alfred Wegener hypothesized that all of the modern day continents had previously been clumped together in a supercontinent which he called Pangaea, from the ancient Greek, which means all lands or all the earth. Wegener published a paper explaining his theory that all the continental landmasses were drifting across the earth, sometimes plowing through the oceans and into each other. He called this movement continental drift. Now, Alfred Wegener came up with several lines of evidence to support his proposal or idea of continental drift. Now, one such evidence to support the continental drift theory was the evidence called the continental puzzle or the continental fit. Now, according to the continental puzzle or continental fit, the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa look as though they would fit together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Now, with a bit of rearranging, most of the continents can be put together too. This was one of the first clues of continental drift according to Alfred Wegener. Now, if you will look at a map of the world, you will notice that most of the land masses, most of the continents would really fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Now, Alfred Wegener noticed that the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa look as though they fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Now, isn't that fascinating indeed? So the east coast of South America fits perfectly with the west coast of Africa. And Alfred Wegener noticed that. So that's how he came up with this evidence called continental fit or the continental puzzle. Now, isn't that fascinating about the continental puzzle or continental fit? Now, sometimes geologists call this the geological fit. Now, the continental puzzle or continental fit or geological fit is the evidence which is the matching of large-scale geological features on different continents. And it has been noted that the coastlines of South America and West Africa seem to match up. Now, another piece of evidence to support the continental drift theory or hypothesis of Alfred Wegener would be the evidence of matching fossils. Now, what is this evidence called matching fossils? Now, fossil evidence for continental drift includes several fossil organisms found on different land masses. Now, Alfred Wegener noticed that the fossilized remains of this aquatic reptile called the Mosasaurus was discovered in two continents. The fossilized remains of the Mosasaurus was discovered in South America, and the same type of fossil of the Mosasaurus was also discovered in Africa. So Wegener proposed that the organisms had lived side by side, but the lands had moved apart after they were dead and fossilized. So he suggested that the organisms would not have been able to travel across the ocean. So he came up with this idea of a supercontinent called Pangaea. So that's the evidence of the matching fossils that would support the theory of continental drift. That fossils of similar types of plants and animals in rocks of similar age have been found on the shores of different continents, including Antarctica, suggesting that these continents were once joined together. So isn't that fascinating indeed? Now, another line of evidence that would support the continental drift hypothesis is the types of rocks and structures. Now, rock evidence for continental drift exists in the form of several mountain belts that end at one coastline only to reappear on a landmass across the ocean. Now, Alfred Wegener considered continental drift by noting the similarity of the rock strata and geological structures of the Appalachian and the Caledonian mountain belts of eastern United States and northwestern Europe respectively. So everybody kind of take a look at these pictures of the mountain ranges of the Appalachian and the Caledonian mountain belts. So similarly, Wegener investigated the continuity of the Precambrian rocks and geological structures between South America and Africa. Wegener said that the rocks had formed side by side and that the land since moved apart. Mountain ranges with the same rock types and structures and ages are now opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean, as you could see in the pictures of the Appalachian and the Caledonian mountains. So Wegener concluded that they formed as a single mountain range that was separated as the continents drifted. Now, another observation favoring continental drift hypothesis or theory of Alfred Wegener was the presence of evidence for continental glaciation. Striations left by the scrapings of glaciers over the land surface indicated that Africa and South America had been close together at the time of this ancient ice age. The same scraping patterns can be found along the coast of South America and South Africa. So this is a strong evidence to support the continental drift hypothesis or theory of Alfred Wegener. Now, in spite of these lines of evidence, the hypothesis or theory of continental drift was rejected. Wegener could not provide an explanation of exactly what made the continents move. Now, after several years, new technology was developed and that led to findings which lead to a new theory called plate tectonics. Okay, so before we continue with our discussion of the continental drift hypothesis, let's watch this fascinating video about Alfred Wegener and his continental drift hypothesis or theory. All right, my dear students, let's watch this.
Take a look at this satellite image of Earth's surface. If you look carefully at the continents, you might notice something which many have noticed in the past, and that is that the continents almost look like they fit together, kind of like the pieces of some sort of giant, massive puzzle. Of course, you probably noticed this the very first time you saw a map of the Earth or a globe while a child in school. The place on the Earth where this is most obvious is along the eastern coast of South America and the western coast of Africa. Here it really appears like the continents fit together. Now, of course, people have known this for hundreds of years, ever since the first accurate maps were created. But most people just chalked it up to mere coincidence. One person who had trouble with that, though, was German meteorologist Alfred Wegener. You see, Wegener couldn't just accept that this was a coincidence and that these land masses had such similar shaped coastlines. And so he began to think about this and try and come up with some sort of explanation. And what he concluded was something radical, that the continents are moving. And in Wegener's head, if the continents are in fact moving, and you run time backwards, there must have been a time when all of those continents were together in some sort of supercontinent, something he named Pangaea, coming from the Greek term for all Earth. This became known as Wegener's theory of continental drift. Now, Wegener, being a man of science, knew that if his theory was going to gain any traction, he needed to provide evidence. And so he set to his life's work of researching every corner of the planet to better understand this strange observation and to explain it to the scientific community. By the end of his life, he had collected 4 main pieces of evidence, and we're going to look at those today. We'll begin where we've already begun, and that is with this shape of the continents. If we look carefully all over the Earth, coastlines appear to fit together, like this part of South America and this part of Africa. And so that becomes evidence number 1, the apparent fit of the continents, that the coastlines appear to fit together like the pieces of some sort of giant puzzle. But of course, this was just a starting point, and so Wegener continued his research. The next thing he dove into involved life. Wegener began to study fossils of ancient creatures, and more importantly, where those fossils were located. Take, for instance, this creature, an ancient freshwater reptile called a Mesosaurus. Interestingly, if you look on all of the continents and land masses of Earth, fossils of the Mesosaurus are only found in 2 places. These include the very southern tip of South America and the southern tip of Africa. Now let's think about this. How could this be possible? We know the Mesosaurus could not have evolved in one location and then traveled to the other. It was a freshwater reptile and therefore could never make the journey through the salty Atlantic Ocean. And so that idea is out the window. Another idea is that perhaps the same exact creature evolved in the same exact way at the same exact time in 2 locations that are separated by thousands of miles. But to Wegener, that was unlikely, if not impossible. And so what he concluded was that during the days when the Mesosaurus thrived, Africa and South America were not separated by an ocean, but rather they were connected as one landmass where the Mesosaurus could roam free. And then at some point later on, those landmasses with the remains of the Mesosaurus were ripped apart and separated by the ocean as we see today. Now, this seemed like a radical idea to Wegener until he began to look at other species of living organisms from the time. And what he found was much the same. There were all sorts of creatures beyond the Mesosaurus, like the Cynonathus and Glossoterus and Lystrosaurus, who all showed very similar, unique fossil distributions, as seen here. And strangely enough, if you reassemble the continents according to their shapes, the distribution of the fossils makes perfect sense. And so this becomes piece of evidence number 2, fossil correlation, or the matching up of similar fossils found in distant locations. At this point, Wegener is excited because his theory is coming together and his ideas seem to have a lot of support. And so he set off to find even more evidence. And he did so by studying geology, or rock structures. Very similar to what he saw with fossil distribution, he saw with rock distribution. In fact, if you look at the mountains of the modern-day northeastern United States, they are the exact type and age of rock found in the mountains of the UK and northern Scandinavia. And so Wegener said to himself, could it be that the same exact rocks formed at the same exact time, but in very different locations? Well, it is possible, but it seems unlikely. And so what Wegener concluded was that those rocks formed at the same time in the same location. And then that area was torn apart by the motion of the continents, carrying those rocks to the distant locations they are in today. And so this becomes evidence number 3. Rock and mountain correlation, or the matching up of similar rocks from distant locations, proving that they were once together. And finally, his 4th piece of evidence is probably the most compelling of all, and this involves a look at the past climate of the Earth. So Wegener studied things like glaciers. And what he knew was that when glaciers move over the surface of the Earth, they leave behind evidence in the form of these glacial striations or deep scratches in the rock that show the direction the ice moved as it dragged over the surface. Now, interestingly, if you look at where on Earth we find glacial striations today, they're located in areas like the Amazon rainforest on the equatorial South American continent and the hot, sticky jungles of Central Africa. Now, of course, these are places where you could not find glaciers today, simply because they're too close to the equator and getting sunlight that is too intense and hot, preventing glaciers from forming. And so what Wegener concluded was that these areas were not always near the equator, but rather in the past they were located closer to the poles, where a colder climate could exist and support glaciers. Similarly, Wegener looked at rocks like bituminous coal, which is a sedimentary rock that can be found on the New York State Earth Science reference tables. You can find this table at this link. Bituminous coal is a sedimentary rock that is made from compacted and cemented plant remains. But not just any plant remains, tropical plant remains from hot, sticky, humid jungles. Interestingly, if you look at the major coal deposits on Earth today, they don't fall in hot, humid areas, but rather they fall in frigid areas like northern Asia and Antarctica. So Wegener knew that if this was the observation he was making, this tropical coal being found in frigid places, that those places must not always have been frigid, and maybe in fact they were once located closer to the equator. And so this becomes piece of evidence number 4, paleoclimate data or past climate data, like finding evidence of coal in currently cold areas and evidence of glaciers in currently warm areas. And so these 4 pieces of evidence put together became the theory of continental drift, as published by Wegener in his book, The Origin of Continents and Oceans. Unfortunately, there was one thing that Wegener could never wrap his mind around, and that was what force could be driving the motion of the continents. He couldn't understand how it would be possible for huge land masses to actually move, considering the amount of force and energy required to do so. And without this explanation, his theory of continental drift remains largely rejected in the scientific community. In November of 1930, while on a research expedition on the ice sheets of Greenland, Wegener froze to death. His body was found in the ice months later. You can still visit a cross that marks the site of his death, frozen on the ice sheets of Greenland. The story of Alfred Wegener is a tragic one. It's the story of a great scientific mind who was ahead of his time, but died before he reached his true potential. Modern geologists owe to him their understanding of how the Earth actually works.
Now, that is really an eye-opening video about the works of Alfred Wegener and his continental drift theory or hypothesis. Now, eventually, this continental drift theory led to the development of a new theory known as plate tectonics. Now, what is this theory of plate tectonics? Now, according to the plate tectonics theory, the planet Earth, especially the layer of the Earth known as the lithosphere, is broken up into what we call as tectonic plates. The Earth has 7 to 8 major and many minor tectonic plates. Now, these tectonic plates, they ride on the asthenosphere, which is actually part of the upper mantle. And these tectonic plates, they exhibit movement. Now, plate tectonics is the theory that the Earth's outer shell or the crust is divided into several plates that glide over the part of the upper mantle called the asthenosphere. The asthenosphere, which is malleable or partially malleable, allows these plates to move around. Now, there are several major plates, and these plates are named after the landforms found on them. The major plates include the North American plate, the Pacific plate, the Eurasian plate, the African plate, the Indo-Australian plate, Australian plate, Indian plate, South American, and Antarctic plate. Now, the largest plate is the Pacific plate at 39,768,522 square miles. Most of it is located under the ocean, and it is moving northwest at a speed of around 2.75 inches per year. Now, the movement of these plates are responsible for volcanic activity, earthquakes, and mountain building. And if you will notice in our diagram that most of the volcanic activity and earthquakes worldwide occur between tectonic plates called plate boundaries. Now, there are 3 types of tectonic plate boundaries. So these are the divergent boundary, convergent boundary, and transform boundaries. Convergent boundaries where plates move into one another, divergent where plates move apart, and transform boundaries where plates move sideways in relation to each other. So again, when we speak of plate boundaries, this is the region or the area between two tectonic plates. And there are three types of plate boundaries. So we have divergent boundaries, we have convergent boundaries, and transform boundaries. Now, a divergent boundary is a type of plate boundary wherein the two tectonic plates move apart. In convergent boundary, the two tectonic plates, they collide with each other, and in transform plate boundaries, the two tectonic plates, they slide past each other. So those are the types of plate boundaries. So we have divergent boundaries wherein the tectonic plates are moving apart, convergent boundaries wherein the tectonic plates are in a collision course, and transform plate boundaries wherein the two tectonic plates are sliding or gliding past each other. Now let's go into the details of the three types of plate boundaries, starting with divergent plate boundaries. Now, divergent plate boundaries are also known as spreading centers. And these are boundaries wherein the two tectonic plates are moving apart. So as you could see in this animated illustration that the two tectonic plates are moving apart, and this illustrates a divergent boundary. Now, one good example of a divergent boundary is the so-called oceanic ridge. Now, an oceanic ridge is an underwater mountain range formed by plate tectonics. This uplifting of the ocean floor occurs when convection currents rise in the mantle beneath the oceanic crust and create magma, where the two tectonic plates meet at a divergent boundary. So as you could see in this animated illustration, magma flows out from that opening, and as magma flows out, it forces the two tectonic plates to move apart. So that's an oceanic ridge. And one good example of an oceanic ridge is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So this Mid-Atlantic Ridge, also known as the Mid-Oceanic Ridge, is an underwater mountain system formed by plate tectonics. It is the result of a divergent plate boundary that runs from 87 degrees north, about 333 kilometers south of the North Pole, to 54 degrees south, just off the coast of Antarctica. So, what happens now in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge or in a Mid-Oceanic Ridge? So, in a Mid-Atlantic Ridge or the Oceanic Ridge, convection cycles help push the magma up, and this separates the two land masses apart. And this explains why South America separated from Africa. Okay, here is another illustration, an animated illustration showing what happens in an oceanic ridge. Okay, so here we have magma. So magma is forced out from that opening. And as the magma is forced out from that opening, it pushes the two land masses apart. So that's what happens in an oceanic ridge. And an oceanic ridge is an example of a divergent boundary. So before we continue on this discussion about divergent boundaries and oceanic ridge, let's watch this fascinating video about oceanic ridge and divergent plate boundaries. Alright, my dear students, let's watch this.
Boundaries. Divergent plate boundaries occur where huge tectonic plates move away from one another. This occurs above rising convection currents. The rising magma pushes up on the bottom of the lithosphere and flows laterally beneath it. This lateral flow causes the plates to move in the direction of the flow. At the plate boundary, the two plates move in opposite directions. Divergent boundaries are constructive boundaries because new crust is formed. As the plates move apart, molten magma fills in the gap and creates new crust. If you look at the map of the major tectonic plates, you can see several divergent plate boundaries. There are two major types of divergent boundaries: continental and continental lithosphere, and oceanic lithosphere. Oceanic and oceanic divergent boundaries occur where two oceanic plates move away from one another. This is where seafloor spreading takes place. The most common example is the mid-ocean ridge, which stretches around the world. The mid-ocean ridge can be seen here in red. Divergent boundaries are constructive boundaries because the rising magma creates new oceanic crust and lithosphere. The mid-ocean ridge runs right through Iceland. Here's what it looks like on land. Imagine this same formation underwater. Continental and continental divergent boundaries occur when two plates of continental lithosphere move away from one another. As the magma rises, new lithosphere is created. The East African Rift Valley was created when continental and continental divergent boundaries moved away from each other. The Red Sea is another example. The Red Sea was formed by the divergence between the African plate and the Arabian plate. The rift transitioned eventually from a continental and continental to a continental and oceanic plate boundary. I hope that helps with divergent boundaries.
Now, that is really fascinating about divergent plate boundaries. Now, as mentioned in the video, divergent plate boundaries can be oceanic divergent boundary and continental divergent boundary. And the best example to illustrate an oceanic divergent plate boundary would be an oceanic ridge. Now, if a divergent boundary occurs beneath the oceanic lithosphere, and we call this the oceanic divergent boundary. So the rising convection current below, as you could see in the diagram, lifts the lithosphere, producing a mid-oceanic ridge. And the mid-Atlantic ridge is a classic example of this type of plate boundary. The ridge is a high area compared to the surrounding seafloor. And because of the lift from the convection current below, this type of boundary creates new oceanic lithosphere. So an oceanic divergent boundary creates new ocean floor, as you could see in this animated illustration. Okay, so that's quite amazing indeed. Now, what about continental divergent plate boundary? Now, continental divergent boundary occurs beneath a thick continental plate, as you could see in this illustration. Here, the thick continental plate is arched upwards from the convection current's lift, pulled in by extensional forces and fractured into a rift-shaped structure, as you could see. Now, an example of a continental divergent boundary is a continental rift. Now, what is a continental rift? Now, when spreading centers develop within a continent, the land mass may split into two or more similar segments, forming a continental rift. Now, one good example of a continental rift is the case of Iceland. Iceland is an example of continental rifting. Iceland has a divergent plate boundary running through its middle. And that is really fascinating indeed. So if we will look closely at Iceland, you could see the mid-Atlantic ridge crossing Iceland through its middle. So you have the North American plate side of Iceland and the Eurasian plate side of Iceland. And these two tectonic plates are moving in the opposite direction. So this means that Iceland is being pulled apart Okay, so that is really interesting indeed. So if you are at the middle of that boundary, will be in two tectonic plates at the same time. On one side you have the North American plate, and in the opposite side you have the Eurasian plate. So that is the case of Iceland. Iceland is a perfect example of continental rifting. Now, another example of a continental divergent plate boundary are rift valleys or grabens. A rift valley or a graben is a linear shaped lowland between several highlands or mountain ranges created by the action of a geologic rift or fault. A rift valley is formed on a divergent plate boundary, a crustal extension, or spreading apart of the surface. So in a rift valley, there are tensional forces. As you could see in this diagram, those two arrows are moving in the opposite direction. Those are the tensional forces. And when these tensional forces are strong enough to cause the plate to split apart, a center block drops between the two blocks at its flanks, forming a graben as you could see in this animated illustration. The drop of the center creates the nearly parallel steeply dipping walls of a rift valley when it is new. That feature is the beginning of the rift valley. So that's how rift valleys are formed. So as you could see again in this animated illustration, those tensional forces, they pull the plates apart and the center block drops between the two blocks, forming a graben. And the best example of a rift valley is the East African Rift Valley. The East African Rift Valley is a classic example of this type of plate boundary. The East Africa Rift Valley is in a very early stage of development. The plate has not been completely rifted, and the Rift Valley is still above the sea level but occupied by lakes at several locations. Also, the Red Sea is an example of this type of Rift Valley. These are plates that have fully separated and the central Rift Valley has dropped below sea level. So before we end with this discussion of divergent plate boundaries, let's watch this fascinating video about again divergent plate boundaries, focusing on continental divergent plate boundaries and oceanic divergent plate boundaries. So let's watch this.